Snow drifted against the tall windows of Morty Tower, turning the lights of the city below into blurred streams of silver and gold. The marble floors of the lobby reflected everything around them, the expensive paintings, the polished columns, and the armed guards who stood like statues outside the private office of the most feared man in the city. Grace Romano sat alone on a stone bench beneath the enormous portrait of Elena Morty, the woman who had built an empire and then spent half of her fortune creating schools, hospitals, and charities in neighborhoods everyone else had forgotten. Grace barely noticed the portrait anymore. She was too tired. At 26 years old and 7 months pregnant, exhaustion had become something that followed her everywhere. Her feet ached inside shoes that had already survived 2 years of double shifts at Bellini's restaurant. A loose thread hung from the sleeve of her uniform, and one of the straps on her handbag had broken earlier that evening. 3 hours had passed since she had arrived. 3 hours of standing, sitting, waiting, and hearing the same answer. "I'm sorry, Miss Romano. Mr. Morty isn't available." 5 minutes. That was all she had asked for. 5 minutes with Luca Moretti. The man controlled shipping companies, hotels, restaurants, investment firms, and more businesses than Grace could count. According to the newspapers, politicians feared him, criminals obeyed him, and powerful men avoided crossing him. According to Grace, he was simply the man whose name appeared on the documents governing the Elena Morty Conservatory. Her younger sister, Ivy, had earned a scholarship there 3 years earlier. That scholarship had changed everything. It had also destroyed everything. Grace shifted uncomfortably on the bench and rested a hand against her stomach. The baby moved slightly, and she smiled despite herself. "I know," she whispered. "I'm trying." One of the guards glanced in her direction. "You should go home," he said quietly. "Mr. Morty doesn't meet people without appointments." Grace looked up at him. "My sister has been trying to get help for months." The guard lowered his eyes. "Then I'm sorry." Grace laughed softly. "Everyone keeps saying that." Beyond the heavy oak doors, muffled voices drifted through the walls. Somewhere inside, Luca Moretti was finishing another meeting while the rest of the city waited for his decisions. Grace wondered if powerful men ever understood what it felt like to wait helplessly for someone else to determine your future. Her thoughts were interrupted when her phone suddenly rang. The screen displayed Ivy's name. Grace answered immediately. "Ivy." The sound that came through the speaker was not a voice at first. It was breathing, fast, frightened breathing. "Grace." Fear shot through her body. "What happened?" "They found the violin." Relief flooded her face. "Then everything is all right." "No." The single word froze her where she sat. It was inside Director Crane's car. Grace stood so quickly that the bench scraped loudly against the floor. "What?" "The police are here. Everyone is here. Crane says I put it there after I realized they were going to search my locker." "You didn't do anything." "I know that." "Then tell them." Another silence followed. Then Ivy spoke again. "He's telling everyone that Luca Moretti ordered them to blame me." The words had barely left her mouth when the doors to the office suddenly opened. The conversation inside ended instantly. Luca Moretti stepped into the hallway. Grace had seen photographs of him before. None of them had prepared her for the man standing a few feet away. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit. A silver watch rested against his wrist. A faint scar crossed one side of his jaw, giving his expression a permanent sharpness. Everything about him suggested wealth, discipline, and danger. The two guards immediately straightened. "Sir?" Luca ignored them. His dark eyes settled on Grace. "Put the call on speaker." Grace stared at him. "What?" "Your sister put the call on speaker." She tightened her grip on the phone. "Why should I trust you?" A strange expression crossed his face. "Because someone just used my name to destroy an innocent girl." Ivy's frightened voice sounded again. "Grace." Luca extended his hand. "Please." Grace hesitated. Then she pressed the button. For a moment, the entire building seemed to fall silent. Luca listened as Ivy described the accusation, the missing violin, the search of her locker, and the discovery of the instrument inside Crane's vehicle. When she finally finished speaking, the silence grew even heavier. Luca's jaw tightened. "Where are you now?" "In the conservatory security office." "Are you free to leave?" "No." Something cold and dangerous appeared in his eyes. The guards exchanged nervous glances. Luca pulled a phone from his pocket. "Seal every entrance to the conservatory. No vehicles leave the property. No records are removed. No one goes anywhere until I arrive." Then he turned toward Grace. "You're coming with me." For the first time in years, Luca Moretti had completely lost control. The convoy reached the Elena Moretti Conservatory 20 minutes later, but the atmosphere around the grand building already felt like the beginning of a war. Police vehicles crowded the circular driveway, while frightened students gathered behind the tall windows overlooking the courtyard. Snow continued to fall across the stone steps, covering the elegant gardens that Elena Moretti herself had designed decades earlier. Grace stepped from the car and immediately saw the enormous bronze letters above the entrance. Beneath the family name was another inscription that seemed strangely out of place in a world ruled by power and fear. "Talent belongs to everyone." Luca stood silently for a moment as he stared at the words. Grace suddenly understood that the building was more than another business to him. It was the last piece of his mother that remained untouched by the violence of the world he controlled. The moment they entered the main hall, Director Vincenzo Crane approached them. His gray suit was perfectly pressed, his silver hair neatly combed, and his expression carefully arranged somewhere between outrage and disappointment. "Mr. Moretti," he said, "thank goodness you've arrived. We have a very unfortunate situation." His gaze shifted toward Grace before settling upon Luca once again. "The young woman responsible has become extremely difficult." Luca's expression hardened. "Where is Ivy Romano?" Crane blinked. "Surely you aren't suggesting—" "I asked a question." The director's smile weakened. "The security office." "Take me there." As they walked through the marble corridors, Grace noticed the students watching from every doorway. Fear filled their eyes. No one spoke. No one moved. The entire building seemed to be holding its breath. The security office was located at the end of a narrow hallway. Grace burst through the door before anyone could stop her. Ivy was sitting alone beside a desk, still wearing her concert dress. Her violin bow remained clutched tightly in one trembling hand. The moment she saw Grace, tears filled her eyes. "I didn't do it." Grace wrapped her arms around her sister immediately. "I know." Luca remained near the doorway. Unlike everyone else in the room, he seemed to be studying details that no one had noticed. His gaze settled on the empty velvet case lying upon the desk. "You said the violin was discovered inside Director Crane's car." "Yes," Ivy replied. "And you insist it isn't the original instrument." "It isn't." Crane laughed quietly. "With all respect, she's 19 years old." Ivy slowly stood. 3 years ago, Mrs. Moretti allowed me to hold that violin while she explained how its sound had changed over time. There was a repaired crack beneath the bridge. It was impossible to miss. She turned toward the evidence case positioned against the wall. "The violin inside that box doesn't have one." The room fell silent. Luca crossed the floor and opened the case. His eyes narrowed almost immediately. The repaired crack was gone. Crane stepped backward. "That's impossible." "No," Ivy answered softly. "What's impossible is believing you never noticed." Luca carefully lifted the instrument into the light. For the first time that night, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Someone had not simply stolen a priceless violin. Someone had replaced it. And suddenly, Grace understood why the most feared man in the city looked as though he had just been betrayed by a ghost. Snow beat softly against the tall windows, while silence settled over the security office. Luca continued examining the violin beneath the bright overhead lights. Everyone else in the room seemed to be waiting for him to speak, but his attention remained fixed upon the instrument resting in his hands. Finally, he carefully turned it over and looked directly at Ivy. "You're absolutely certain?" She nodded immediately. "I practiced with Mrs. Morty's violin dozens of times. She always said the crack made the instrument stronger because someone had cared enough to repair it instead of replacing it." Grace noticed something change in Luca's expression when he heard his mother's name. The cold authority that surrounded him seemed to weaken for only a moment. Director Crane folded his arms. "Even if the original instrument has been exchanged, that proves nothing. Miss Romano could have switched them herself." "That's impossible," Grace replied. Crane smiled politely. "People become remarkably creative when their future is at stake." Before Grace could answer, Luca spoke. "Show me her locker." The entire group moved through the dimly lit corridors of the conservatory until they reached the students' changing rooms. Police officers stood nearby while a line of anxious teachers watched from a distance. Ivy's locker door remained open. The empty velvet case sat inside exactly where it had been found. Luca crouched quietly and examined the interior. Then he ran his fingers along one corner and held them beneath the light. "Adhesive." One of the officers stepped closer. "Excuse me. The label was attached recently." Crane immediately shook his head. "That proves nothing." Luca rose slowly to his feet. "It proves someone wanted this evidence to be discovered." The director's confident smile began to fade. Just then, Ivy suddenly pulled a small notebook from her bag. Grace recognized it immediately. Ivy carried it everywhere. "My practice journal," Ivy explained. She opened several pages and placed the notebook on the table. Dates, sketches, measurements, and musical notes filled every page. "Mrs. Morty taught me to pay attention to details. Last week, I recorded the position of the repaired crack because I loved the way the light reflected from the wood." Luca studied the drawing carefully. The crack was clearly visible. The violin inside the evidence case looked completely different. The police officer frowned. "Then when was the switch made?" Nobody answered. Ivy slowly turned another page. A strange expression crossed her face. "What is it?" Grace asked. "This." She pointed toward a note written near the bottom of the page. 4 months earlier, Director Crane had borrowed the violin for a private gathering of donors. Luca turned toward Crane. "You removed the instrument from the vault." Crane straightened his jacket. "I had permission." "From whom?" "From your office." "I never gave such permission." For the first time that evening, genuine fear flashed across Crane's face. At that exact moment, one of Luca's men entered the room carrying a thick folder. "Sir, I found something." Inside were records from the past 3 years. Grace opened the first file. A scholarship student named Daniel Cho had been accused of stealing a valuable cello bow. The second student had supposedly damaged an antique flute. The third had vanished after being blamed for replacing an expensive violin with a counterfeit copy. Every accusation ended exactly the same way. Every investigation had been supervised by Vincenzo Crane. Every student had been poor. And every signature at the bottom of every page belonged to the same man, Director Vincenzo Crane. Meanwhile, somewhere inside the enormous conservatory, a door quietly opened and closed. Someone had just slipped into the darkness. A sharp wind swept across the courtyard as Luca's men spread throughout the conservatory. The enormous building suddenly felt less like a school and more like a fortress preparing for battle. Police officers moved through hallways lined with portraits of musicians, while nervous teachers whispered behind closed doors. Somewhere inside the building, a shadow was moving, and everyone knew it. Grace remained beside Ivy as Luca reviewed the files recovered from the archives. One by one, the names of former scholarship students appeared before him. Each story followed the same pattern. Valuable instruments disappeared. Accusations were made. Evidence appeared as though by magic. The students were expelled and the instruments were never seen again. "What happened to them?" Grace asked quietly. Luca lifted his eyes from the papers. "That's exactly what I intend to discover." Crane folded his arms. "You can't possibly believe these children are innocent." Grace turned toward him immediately. "You selected every single one of them. I supervised the investigations. You controlled them." Crane's face darkened, but before he could answer, one of the officers hurried into the room. "Sir, we've searched the security office. And we found evidence that several camera recordings were erased." Crane sighed heavily. "As I explained earlier, the system failed." The officer shook his head. "No, sir. Someone deliberately removed the files." A dangerous silence settled over the room. Luca stepped toward the director. "Who had access?" "Only senior staff members." "Names?" Crane hesitated. Luca's voice grew colder. "Now." As the director reluctantly began listing employees, Ivy slowly walked toward one of the large windows overlooking the performance hall. Her eyes narrowed. "Grace." Her sister immediately crossed the room. "What is it?" Ivy pointed toward the stage below. "Look at the piano." At first, Grace saw nothing unusual. Then she noticed it. One of the wheels beneath the enormous instrument had left a fresh mark across the wooden floor. Someone had moved it recently. Luca followed their gaze. "Was there a performance tonight?" Crane answered too quickly. "No." Ivy was already moving toward the door. "The stage." Within moments, everyone had entered the vast auditorium. Hundreds of empty seats stretched into darkness beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers above. The grand piano stood in the center of the stage, exactly where it should have been. Except for the wheel marks. Ivy knelt beside them. "They don't stop here." Grace looked more carefully. Her sister was right. The marks disappeared behind a heavy velvet curtain at the back of the stage. One of Luca's guards pulled the fabric aside. A narrow metal door stood hidden behind it. Crane's face became pale. "That storage room hasn't been used for years." Luca glanced at him. "Then you won't mind opening it." The director produced a key with trembling fingers. The door slowly swung inward. A cold gust of air emerged from the darkness beyond. Flashlights illuminated a narrow stone staircase leading underground. Dust covered the steps. Every step except one. Fresh footprints stretched downward into the shadows. Then Grace heard another sound. A metallic crash echoed somewhere beneath them. Someone was already inside. Without hesitation, Luca drew the pistol hidden beneath his jacket and stepped into the darkness. Grace looked down at her stomach, took a deep breath and followed him anyway. The underground staircase descended farther than Grace had expected. The sounds of the conservatory gradually disappeared behind them until only the echoes of footsteps remained. The air smelled of dust, damp stone, and old wood. Luca moved ahead with one hand resting on the pistol concealed beneath his coat, while two of his men followed close behind. Grace kept one arm around her stomach as Ivy walked beside her, gripping her violin bow as though it were a weapon. At the bottom of the staircase, the narrow passage divided into two corridors. Rusted pipes stretched overhead and weak lights flickered against the walls. Then another sound echoed through the darkness. It was not the metallic crash they had heard before. This time, it was the sound of running footsteps. "Over there," one of the guards whispered. The men rushed forward. A shadow appeared at the far end of the corridor, before disappearing around a corner. Luca immediately followed. "Wait," Grace shouted. He stopped just long enough to look back at her. "You should remain here and let the person responsible escape. You are pregnant, and you are stubborn." To Grace's surprise, the corner of his mouth almost lifted into a smile. The pursuit continued until the passage finally opened into a large storage chamber hidden beneath the conservatory. Rows of wooden shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Dozens of empty instrument cases lay scattered across the room. Ivy gasped. Grace looked toward the nearest shelf and froze. Each case carried a carefully written label. Daniel Cho, Samantha Reed, Nathan Bell. Every name belonged to a former scholarship student who had been accused of theft. Luca slowly walked farther into the room. "This wasn't random," he said quietly. Ivy nodded. "He chose them." Grace turned toward her sister. "What do you mean?" "He selected students whose families had no money and no influence. Even if they fought back, nobody would believe them." One of the guards suddenly called from the opposite side of the room. "Sir?" A collection of ledgers sat on an old table beneath a single lamp. Luca opened the first book. Dates, names, descriptions, prices. Grace felt her blood turn cold. These were sales records. The missing instruments had not been destroyed. They had been sold. Then Ivy pulled another file from one of the shelves. "What is this?" Inside were photographs. Dozens of photographs. Each student had been secretly watched, questioned, and investigated long before accusations were ever made. Grace stared in disbelief. "He planned everything." Luca's expression darkened. "No." He slowly held up another photograph. "He didn't." The picture showed Crane standing beside a man whose face had been deliberately scratched away. Someone else had been helping him. At that moment, Grace felt a sharp pain spread through her abdomen. Her hand immediately moved toward her stomach. Luca turned. "What happened?" "Nothing." Another pain followed. This one was stronger. Ivy rushed toward her. "Grace." "I'm fine." Luca stepped closer. "You aren't." Grace forced herself to stand straight. "We'll deal with that later. You need a doctor. And my sister needs justice." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then Luca carefully removed his jacket and placed it around her shoulders. The gesture caught her completely by surprise. "You can fight me later," he said quietly. "Right now you need to sit down." For the first time that night, Grace realized that the man standing before her was not merely protecting his family's reputation. Someone had attacked the last dream his mother had left behind. And Luca Moretti intended to find out who it was, no matter what it cost him. The hidden chamber remained silent after Luca placed his jacket around Grace's shoulders. For a few moments, no one spoke. The ledgers, the photographs, and the rows of abandoned instrument cases had already revealed enough to destroy careers, but Luca had spent his entire life learning that the first truth was rarely the last one. Ivy slowly walked along one of the shelves until she reached a narrow cabinet built into the stone wall. Unlike the others, it was secured with a brass lock engraved with the Moretti family crest. "That shouldn't be here," Luca said quietly. "Why not?" Grace asked. "Because only my mother had a key." One of the guards stepped forward, but Luca raised a hand. "No." He took the key hanging around his neck beneath his shirt and inserted it into the lock. A soft click echoed through the chamber. Inside lay a stack of journals, several photographs, and a leather-bound register covered with a layer of dust. Luca carefully lifted the book into the light. The final signature inside belonged to Elena Moretti. The date had been written 4 months before her death. Grace watched his expression change as he turned the pages. Beneath lists of performances, donations, and scholarship records, a short message had been written in elegant handwriting. "The students are innocent." Luca stared at the words without moving. Another sentence appeared below them. "I know who is responsible." Then at the bottom of the page, only 2 words remained. "Ask Crane." The room became perfectly still. Ivy was the first to speak. "Your mother knew." Luca closed the book. Yes. Then why didn't she stop him? Perhaps she intended to. At that moment, footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Everyone turned. One of Luca's men appeared in the doorway, breathing heavily. Sir Crane has disappeared. Luca's eyes narrowed. What? His office is empty. His car is gone. Security cameras show him leaving the building 15 minutes ago. Grace rose immediately. He knew we would find this room. Luca nodded. He was never trying to defend himself. He was buying time, Ivy added. Another guard entered the chamber carrying a small metal box. We found this hidden beneath Crane's desk. Inside were bank statements, shipping documents, and photographs of rare instruments. Grace noticed addresses in Paris, London, Geneva, and Rome. Then Ivy suddenly froze. What is it? Grace asked. Her sister pointed toward one photograph. The man standing beside Crane was holding the legendary Moretti violin. Grace looked more carefully. The face was partially hidden, but the ring on the man's hand was clearly visible. Luca recognized it immediately. The silver ring bore the symbol of the Moretti family. Someone from inside the organization had been helping Crane. The discovery struck Luca harder than the theft itself. Betrayal from an enemy could be expected. Betrayal from family could not. Just then, Grace bent forward as another sharp pain spread through her body. This time she could not hide it. Luca crossed the room immediately. How long has this been happening? She looked away. Since yesterday. You should have said something. And leave Ivy alone. His expression hardened. You cannot protect everyone. Grace slowly straightened her shoulders. Neither can you. For the first time in many years, Luca Moretti found himself unable to answer. Then his phone rang. The call came from the guard stationed at the front gate. Sir, the man said breathlessly, Crane just sent a message. Luca's face darkened. What does it say? The answer came immediately. If you want the violin, come alone. Snow continued falling as dawn slowly spread across the city, covering rooftops, streets, and the towering buildings belonging to the Moretti family. Luca stood silently in his office while Crane's message remained open on the screen of his phone. Every instinct he possessed urged him to walk into the trap alone. For years, people had feared him because he never hesitated when someone threatened his family. Yet Grace's words continued echoing through his mind. You cannot protect everyone. Neither can you. He looked toward the large sofa where Grace rested beneath a blanket. A doctor from the Moretti family had examined her an hour earlier and ordered complete bed rest. Grace had agreed only after forcing the doctor to promise that Ivy would remain under protection. Ivy herself was seated at the enormous conference table, carefully studying the ledgers recovered from the hidden chamber. Papers covered almost every surface around her. Names, dates, locations, and shipping records slowly revealed the shape of a conspiracy that had been growing for years. Suddenly, she sat upright. I found something. Luca crossed the room immediately. Show me. Ivy pointed towards several transactions listed under different company names. These accounts transferred money to the same place. Grace looked up. Where? A storage facility near the river. Luca examined the documents carefully. The payments began 4 years ago. That's when the first scholarship student disappeared, Ivy replied. Another detail caught Grace's attention. Look at the signatures. Every document carried Crane's name. Every document except one. That signature belonged to someone, identified only by 2 letters. A.M. Luca's expression darkened. Those are my uncle's initials. The room fell silent. Alessandro Moretti had served as Elena Moretti's financial advisor for more than 20 years. He had attended family celebrations, celebrated holidays with them, and stood beside Luca at his mother's funeral. Grace slowly shook her head. No. I know. You don't sound convinced. Luca folded the papers and slipped them into his pocket. Because I recognize his handwriting. At that moment, one of Luca's men entered the office. We found Crane. Everyone turned. Where? Luca asked. At the river warehouse. Alive? Yes. Alone? The guard hesitated. We don't know. Within minutes, the convoy was moving through the sleeping city. Grace insisted upon coming despite the doctor's objections. Luca argued with her for nearly 5 minutes before finally surrendering. The warehouse stood beside the frozen river at the edge of the city. Weak lights glowed through the dirty windows, and a thick layer of snow covered the surrounding ground. Ivy suddenly grabbed Luca's arm. Wait! He turned toward her. What is it? She pointed downward. Footprints covered the snow. There were dozens of them. Luca studied the ground carefully. Crane had not come alone. Then a familiar voice echoed through the darkness. That observation came from your mother. Everyone turned toward the entrance of the warehouse. Alessandro Morty stepped into the light. The silver ring on his finger glittered beneath the falling snow. Grace felt her heart stop. The traitor had been standing beside Luca all along. And judging by the pistol in Alessandro's hand, the betrayal was far from over. Snow swirled through the warehouse entrance as Alessandro Morty stepped forward with the pistol resting calmly in his hand. The silver ring of the Morty family flashed beneath the pale light overhead, and for a moment even Luca appeared unable to move. Grace understood why. Betrayal was always more painful when it wore a familiar face. Alessandro's expression remained perfectly calm. He looked less like a criminal preparing for a confrontation and more like an elegant businessman arriving for an evening meeting. You look surprised, he said quietly. Luca's voice was colder than the winter air surrounding them. You helped him. Alessandro glanced toward the shadows behind him. I guided him. As if responding to the words, Vincenzo Crane emerged from the darkness. The director's expensive suit was stained with dust, and exhaustion had replaced the confidence he had displayed inside the conservatory. Grace instinctively stepped closer to Ivy. Crane smiled weakly. You found the chamber. Ivy looked directly into his eyes. You destroyed innocent lives. No, Crane replied. I simply discovered how easily powerful people ignore the poor. Grace felt her anger rising. You selected students whose families couldn't defend themselves. And who allowed me to do it? Crane asked. Who signed the reports, who accepted the accusations, who looked the other way? No one answered. The terrible truth settled heavily over everyone standing there. Crane had committed the crimes, but dozens of others had chosen convenience over courage. Luca stepped forward. Where is the violin? Alessandro smiled. Safe. You betrayed my mother. No. The older man's eyes darkened. Your mother betrayed the family. A deep silence followed. Luca's jaw tightened. Be careful. She wanted to transform us into something respectable. Hospitals, schools, charities. She spent millions building opportunities for strangers while powerful enemies waited for weakness. She believed fear was not the only way to lead. And she was wrong. Grace watched the struggle unfolding inside Luca's expression. He was standing between two legacies. One had been built upon power, and the other had been built upon hope. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed outside the warehouse. Police sirens. Alessandro laughed softly. You brought the authorities. No, Luca answered. They came because the law still exists. Crane's smile disappeared. The director slowly reached into his pocket and removed a small electronic device. Then we have a problem. Grace immediately recognized the object. It was a detonator. Ivy gasped. Luca moved forward. Crane raised his hand. Stay where you are. What have you done? Crane's expression hardened. The ledgers, the records, the photographs, the shipping accounts, everything is inside this building. Grace suddenly understood. He intends to destroy the evidence. Crane nodded. If I disappear, so does the truth. Then, without warning, another sharp pain shot through Grace's body. She staggered backward and instinctively wrapped both arms around her stomach. Luca turned immediately. Grace. She tried to answer, but another wave of pain struck before she could speak. Ivy rushed toward her sister. Luca's attention shifted between Grace and the detonator in Crane's hand. For the first time in years, the powerful head of the Morty family found himself facing something he could not control. And Crane knew it. Grace struggled to remain standing as another wave of pain spread through her body. The warehouse lights blurred before her eyes, and she instinctively reached for the nearest table to steady herself. Ivy immediately wrapped an arm around her shoulders, while Luca stood frozen between two disasters. On one side stood Crane with his finger resting upon the detonator. On the other stood the woman who had challenged him, changed him, and somehow taught him that protecting people and controlling them were not the same thing. Alessandro saw the hesitation immediately. "You always were your mother's son," he said quietly. "You think everyone can be saved." Luca slowly turned toward him. "And you never believed anyone was worth saving." Crane glanced nervously toward the warehouse windows as the sound of approaching police sirens grew louder. "You promised me protection." Alessandro laughed softly. "I promised you opportunity. You said the family would shield us. The family shields itself." For the first time, fear appeared in Crane's eyes. Grace suddenly realized that the director had spent years believing he was a partner in the conspiracy when he had actually been nothing more than another tool. Another painful contraction forced her to bend forward. Luca immediately crossed the room. "You're leaving." She shook her head. "Not without Ivy." "That wasn't a request." Grace looked directly into his eyes. "Then I refuse." For a brief moment, the corner of his mouth lifted despite the danger surrounding them. Even now, she was still arguing with him. Suddenly, Ivy stepped away from her sister and faced Crane. "You made one mistake." Crane frowned. "Only one." "You chose musicians." Confusion crossed the director's face. Ivy slowly pointed toward the enormous instrument cases stacked along the warehouse wall. "You spent years stealing instruments, but you never learned how musicians think." Crane looked around. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Of course you don't." Ivy pointed toward one particular case, positioned near the rear entrance. "The violin is inside that one." Crane's expression changed instantly. Luca saw it. So did everyone else. Before Crane could react, one of Luca's men lunged forward. The detonator fell from Crane's hand and slid across the floor. At the same instant, Alessandro raised his pistol. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse. Grace screamed. Luca turned sharply. Alessandro was running toward the back entrance, while one of the guards collapsed to the floor with a wound to his shoulder. The next few seconds passed in complete chaos. Police officers burst through the main entrance while Crane desperately attempted to reach the detonator. Luca kicked the device across the floor and sent Crane crashing against a wooden crate. The older man struggled to stand. "It's too late." "No," Luca replied calmly. "It's exactly on time." Outside, police officers surrounded Alessandro before he could disappear into the darkness. Years of betrayal ended in silence as handcuffs closed around his wrists. Inside the warehouse, Ivy slowly approached the instrument case she had identified. Her hands trembled as she opened it. There, resting beneath a velvet cloth, lay the legendary Morty violin. The repaired crack beneath the bridge was still visible. The silver mark inside the instrument remained untouched. They had found it. At that exact moment, Grace doubled over as a stronger contraction swept through her body. Luca immediately caught her before she fell. Then Grace looked into his eyes and whispered the words that made every person in the warehouse stop moving. "The baby is coming." Snow was still falling when the convoy reached Morty Memorial Hospital. The recovered violin rested safely in an evidence case, while police officers escorted Crane and Alessandro into separate vehicles. Years of deception had finally come to an end, yet Luca could not bring himself to look away from Grace as doctors hurried her through the hospital doors. For the first time in many years, the man who controlled half the city felt completely powerless. Hours passed. The rising sun cast pale golden light across the waiting room, while Ivy sat quietly beside him. The legendary violin lay on the chair next to her. "You should get some rest," Luca said. Ivy shook her head. "Grace never rested when I needed her." Luca understood. A short time later, one of the doctors emerged from the delivery room with a smile on his face. "Congratulations." Luca immediately rose to his feet before realizing what the doctor had actually said. The older man laughed softly. "Not you, Mr. Morty." For the first time in years, embarrassment appeared on Luca's face. The doctor continued smiling. "Mother and baby are both healthy." Relief swept through the room. When Luca finally entered, Grace was sitting upright in bed, exhaustion visible in her eyes. A tiny bundle rested peacefully in her arms. "You stayed," she said quietly. He looked at her as though the question itself made no sense. "Of course." Grace glanced toward the window. "You could have been rebuilding your empire." Luca slowly pulled a chair closer to the bed. "My mother spent her entire life building something better than an empire." Later that morning, news of Crane's arrest spread throughout the city. Every student who had been falsely accused received an official apology. The missing funds were frozen, stolen instruments were recovered, and the board of directors was dissolved entirely. A week later, teachers, parents, former students, and scholarship recipients gathered inside the conservatory's performance hall. Luca stood before them. "For too many years," he said, "this institution belonged to a name instead of the people it was meant to serve." He announced the formation of an independent council that would oversee every decision publicly. No director would ever possess absolute authority again. The audience rose to its feet. Then Luca turned toward Grace. "I have one final announcement." She folded her arms suspiciously. "I don't like the sound of that." A faint smile crossed his face. "The position of Director of Student Affairs has become available." Grace laughed softly. "You're offering me a job." "No." He looked toward the council members. "I'm offering you an opportunity to apply." 3 weeks later, she earned the position herself. That evening, Ivy walked onto the stage carrying the recovered Morty violin. Grace sat in the front row holding her sleeping child while Luca remained quietly beside her. As the first notes filled the hall, Grace finally understood something that years of struggle had hidden from her. She had never been weak. She had simply been carrying too much alone. Luca glanced toward her. "What are you thinking about?" Grace smiled. "How strange life is." "Why?" "Because I came here crying outside your office." He looked toward the stage where Ivy continued playing. "And now?" Grace looked down at her child before turning toward him. "Now every door is open." And for the first time since Elena Morty's death, the music returned home.